Chapter 1. A most agreeable afternoon. It was one of those rare English afternoons when the sun, mild and golden, seemed to have remembered its manners. The village of Willowbrook, a place so quiet that even the gossip was genteel, rested beneath a blue sky dappled with thin clouds. The air carried the scent of late roses, mingled with a faint whiff of cut grass and the distant rhythmic hum of a lawn mower. Miss Jane Marple, neat as a pin and wearing a straw hat with a faded blue ribbon, was taking tea in the vicarage garden. She had been invited, along with a few other ladies from the parish, to inspect the vicar's newly pruned rose beds and sample Mrs. Ellison's homemade sponge cake, which had already been praised at length by nearly everyone present. "It's quite the best sponge I've ever made," Mrs. Ellison was saying with modest pride that deceived no one. "I used the new eggs from Mrs. Larkin's hens. They make all the difference, you know." "Ah, fresh eggs," murmured Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling faintly. "It is remarkable how many things in life improve when they are fresh." The vicar, a kindly but absent-minded man, was explaining something about the church roof fund to Colonel Harcourt, while two young women from the village, Miss Nora Blackwood and Miss Hetty Long, sat apart near the lilac bushes, whispering in that confidential tone that can only mean one thing: news. "Such a lovely day," sighed Mrs. Ellison. "One might almost believe nothing unpleasant could ever happen in Willowbrook." Miss Marple smiled gently into her teacup. Experience had taught her that such remarks were nearly always followed by something unpleasant indeed. A small disturbance. At 4:30, as the church clock chimed the hour, a commotion arose from the direction of the old garden gate, a weathered wooden gate at the far end of the vicarage grounds, leading onto a narrow lane that ran behind the cottages. It was an unremarkable gate, seldom used and known, quite affectionately, as the gate that never locked. Young Peter Ellison came running across the lawn, his face pale and his hands dirty. "Mother, Mrs. Ellison, please come quick. There's a man lying by the hedge." The vicar nearly dropped his teacup. "Good heavens! Where?" "By the garden gate, sir. I think he's hurt." The group hurried to the far end of the garden, skirts brushing the grass and hats clutched against the rising breeze. Miss Marple followed quietly, her blue eyes alert. Years of experience, both in the domestic dramas of village life and the darker mysteries that sometimes intruded upon it, had made her observant of small details others missed. There, half hidden by the overgrown hedge, lay a man. He was dressed in a brown tweed coat, his hat a few feet away and his right hand still clutching a pair of gardening shears. His face was oddly still, and a faint discoloration marked the skin around his lips. "Mr. Jerome!" gasped Mrs. Ellison. "It's old Mr. Jerome from the post office." The vicar knelt, hesitated, and then looked up helplessly. He's gone, I'm afraid." A silence fell over the little group. Somewhere beyond the wall, a blackbird began to sing, cheerful and oblivious. The juxtaposition was almost cruel. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, looked down at the still figure. "How very sad," she murmured. "He was a most punctual man, always opening the post office at 8 on the dot. To be late, even for one's own death, is quite out of character." Mrs. Ellison, flustered and tearful, wrung her hands. "He was trimming the hedge, perhaps. Poor soul, struck down with heart failure, I dare say." The vicar nodded uncertainly. Yes, heart failure, that must be it." But Miss Marple did not nod. She bent slightly, studying the shears, the position of the hat, the faint streak of green on the man's sleeve, and the gate, still swinging lightly on its hinges, though the day was calm. "It seems odd," she said softly, "that Mr. Jerome would be cutting this hedge. It belongs to the vicarage, does it not?" "Well, yes," said Mrs. Ellison, blinking. "But he was always so helpful, you know." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. But helpfulness has its limits, I think, especially when one is found dead on another person's property." The arrival of Inspector Graves. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from Marleycombe, the small crowd had swelled. News travelled fast in Willowbrook. The butcher's boy had carried the story as efficiently as any newspaper headline, and soon half the village seemed to have found urgent errands leading past the vicarage. The inspector was a large man with a stiff collar and a serious expression. He took statements briskly and examined the scene with the practised indifference of one who has seen death in less charming places. "Heart attack, most likely," he announced at last. "We'll have the doctor confirm, of course." He gave a polite nod to Miss Marple, whom he knew by reputation. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. A sad business." "Indeed, Inspector, though I am not entirely certain it is only sad. Sometimes such things are also curious." Graves raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" She gave a small apologetic smile. "It's only that the garden gate has never been locked, at least not in living memory, and yet this morning I noticed it was locked. I had to use the side path instead. Someone must have unlocked it again quite recently." The inspector frowned. "You're sure?" "Oh, quite. And Mr. Jerome was not a man to interfere with locks. He valued habits too much." Graves made a note in his book. "I see. You think someone else was here?" "I merely think," said Miss Marple gently, "that people very rarely die tidily, Inspector. And this death, if you will forgive the expression, seems too tidy altogether." As dusk fell over Willowbrook, the police carried the body away, the villagers dispersed, and the vicar's garden returned to silence. But for Miss Marple, the peace was only an illusion, for behind that humble wooden gate, and the man who lay beside it, she sensed the faint but unmistakable scent of something rotten beneath the roses, something that would not stay buried for long. Chapter 2. Whispers at the vicarage gate. Morning in Willowbrook had a habit of making everything appear innocent again. The sun rose obligingly over the thatched roofs, lighting the soft mist that clung to the hedgerows and washing the narrow lanes in pale gold. Milk bottles gleamed on doorsteps, curtains were drawn aside, and the first faint smoke curled from kitchen chimneys. But beneath the calm, the village was alive with talk. By 8 o'clock, every shopkeeper, housemaid, and gardener had heard about the unfortunate incident at the vicarage. Some called it a dreadful accident, others a sudden seizure, and a few, those with keener imaginations, spoke darkly of foul play. By 10, the matter had become so embroidered that poor Mr. Jerome was said to have been found with a dagger in his chest, a bottle of poison by his side, and a mysterious note in his pocket, all of which, of course, were quite untrue. It was at that precise hour that Miss Marple, seated by her parlour window with her embroidery and a pot of weak China tea, received her first visitor of the day. It was Mrs. Larkin, a plump, rosy woman of determined good cheer, who kept the village's small sweet shop, and was an inexhaustible source of information, both wanted and otherwise. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "you have heard, I suppose, about poor Mr. Jerome. Terrible business, terrible, and such a respectable man, too. Never a cross word to anyone. Well, except Mr. Price from the council, but that was about the hedge trimming, and one can't count that, can one?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Indeed, I have heard, Mrs. Larkin. I was present, in fact." Mrs. Larkin clasped her hands. "You were there. Oh, what a shock that must have been. But tell me, between us, was it really a heart attack? Because Mrs. Ellison says the inspector looked most serious, and Dr. Penrose was sent for twice." Miss Marple threaded her needle delicately. "I should not like to say, my dear. One mustn't speculate without facts." "Oh, but that's just it," said Mrs. Larkin eagerly. "There are facts, or so people say. Apparently he'd had words with someone only the day before, about money. Or maybe it was a woman. You know what men are." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes," she said softly. "I do know what men are." The gossip grows. By afternoon, the entire village had taken sides in the matter. The post office remained closed, its blinds drawn, a most unsettling sight in so orderly a place. Mr. Jerome's assistant, a nervous young man named Ernest Copley, had been seen entering the police station, which was quite enough to convince some that he was under suspicion. At the Rose and Crown, the local inn, Colonel Harcourt was declaring over his pint that it was nothing more than indigestion, while Miss Nora Blackwood, the vicar's niece who was visiting from London, insisted in rather dramatic tones that she had heard a quarrel near the garden the night before. And everywhere one went, the same phrase was repeated in tones of gleeful horror. At the garden gate, the one that never locked. A quiet visit. That evening Miss Marple took her customary walk before supper. The air had cooled, a fine rain had begun to fall, misting the hedgerows. The lane behind the vicarage was still cordoned off with a piece of blue police tape, something quite alien in Willowbrook, and the old gate stood ajar, its hinges creaking faintly in the damp. She paused there a long moment, gazing thoughtfully at the ground. The earth near the hedge was disturbed. Heavy footprints, two distinct sets, one large, one small. The larger, she noted, had a curious inward tilt at the heel, and then there was something else, a faint glimmer beneath the hedge. She crouched delicately and retrieved a small object wrapped in mud, a silver button, finely made with an engraved R. Said Miss Marple softly. How very curious indeed. She slipped the button into her handkerchief and walked on toward the village green. Her path took her past the post office, where a young man stood anxiously fumbling with a key. "Good evening, Mr. Copley," she called gently. He started as though struck, then managed a wan smile. "Evening, Miss Marple. I'm just tidying a bit. Place looks queer, empty like this." "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly. "One grows accustomed to certain routines, doesn't one?" The sound of Mr. Jerome turning the key at 8 o'clock sharp. It was rather like the church bell. One felt the day hadn't begun until it happened. Mr. Copley nodded miserably. "He was strict, ma'am, but fair. I'll miss him." Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "You'd been with him quite some time, hadn't you?" 3 years next month. "Ah, then you must know his ways better than anyone. Tell me, did he often go to the vicarage gardens?" Copley looked surprised. "No, ma'am, hardly ever. Said he couldn't abide the vicar's cat." Miss Marple gave a small nod as if that answered everything. "Quite understandable. Cats do reveal much about a person's temper." She bid him good evening and continued home, her mind quietly turning over the morning's details like cards in a deck. The village supper. That night a small supper was held at the vicarage for close friends and well-wishers. It was, as Mrs. Ellison put it, to maintain the proper sense of community in difficult times, though everyone knew it was, primarily to exchange theories. Miss Marple arrived punctually, wearing her grey shawl and carrying a small bouquet of rosemary. "For remembrance," she said with a faint smile. Inside, the air buzzed with talk. Colonel Harcourt, carving cold ham, was declaring that Mr. Jerome had been a thrifty fellow, perhaps too thrifty. Mrs. Ellison whispered that Dr. Penrose had looked most grave, and Miss Blackwood fluttered her eyelashes and suggested that perhaps something in the tea had disagreed with the poor man. Only the vicar seemed genuinely subdued. "He was a good man," he said quietly. "A bit fussy, perhaps, but good." Miss Marple patted his arm. "Indeed he was, Reverend. Though I wonder, did he perhaps mention to you any trouble of late? Any quarrel? Any matter that disturbed him?" The vicar hesitated. "Now that you mention it, he did seem troubled last week. Something about an old letter, I think. He said he'd found it in a drawer that wasn't his. But before I could ask further, he changed the subject." Miss Marple's expression softened. "An old letter. How interesting. I do find that letters, like garden gates, have a way of opening onto unexpected paths." When she returned home that evening, the village lay silent, the lamps glowing faintly through the mist. Miss Marple placed the silver button on her writing desk beside her teacup, her knitting, and a small notebook labeled Observations. She sat quietly for a long time, listening to the distant toll of the church bell. Then she wrote one neat line in her careful hand. "A gate once locked, then open. A man dead where he should not be, and someone, quite tidy, who wanted it to look like chance. She underlined the last phrase once firmly. Then with a small sigh, she folded her hands. Outside, the wind moved through the garden hedge with a faint whispering sound, like secrets passing from one shadow to another. Chapter 3. The Letter in the Drawer. The next morning dawned grey and uncertain, as if the sky itself were undecided whether to rain or clear. A faint mist hung over Willowbrook, softening its edges, the cottages, the church spire, even the ancient oak on the green. The village, though outwardly calm, was quietly fermenting beneath the surface. Miss Marple, whose mind was as orderly as her sitting-room, took her breakfast tray by the window. 1 boiled egg, half a slice of toast, and a modest portion of marmalade. She did not rush. The events of the previous days had made her thoughtful. A locked gate, an unexpected death, a silver button with the letter R, and now a mention of an old letter found in a drawer. Letters, she reflected, had a way of being inconvenient. They could lie quietly for years, and then, with the smallest prod, bring the past back like a ghost through the keyhole. The visit to the vicarage. By 10:30, Miss Marple had made up her mind to call upon the vicar. She brought with her a jar of quince, jelly, a perfectly legitimate pretext for conversation, and found Mrs. Ellison in the garden, still fussing over her roses as if nothing as vulgar as death had ever occurred upon the premises. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "do come in. We've just had the doctor again. Poor Reverend Ellison has been quite shaken by all this talk. The papers have been dreadful, you know. They do so like to exaggerate." "Indeed they do," said Miss Marple mildly, "though sometimes exaggeration conceals a grain of truth, like a flower pressing itself through gravel." She was shown into the vicar's study, a room smelling faintly of ink, dust, and pipe smoke. The Reverend Ellison sat behind his desk, his expression weary but welcoming. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "how kind of you to come. These are trying times for a small parish. And all over poor Jerome, a man who, though exacting, hardly deserved such an end." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You mentioned yesterday, Reverend, that he had found an old letter. I wonder if you would tell me more." The vicar frowned slightly, as though uncertain. Yes. He said it was among some old church papers. He came by last week to deliver the quarterly accounts and seemed rather flustered. He said he'd opened the wrong drawer in the vestry desk and found something that didn't belong there. Did he show it to you?" "No, he only said it was none of my concern, but of great interest to someone else." Then he looked quite nervous, almost frightened. "I thought little of it at the time." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And what became of the letter?" "That I cannot say. It's not in the vestry desk now. Inspector Graves looked." She nodded gently, her eyes thoughtful. "People often remove things they shouldn't, Reverend, especially when those things tell the truth." Inspector Graves calls again. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves himself came knocking at Miss Marple's door. He removed his hat politely, though his manner suggested mild impatience. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Inspector. Do sit down. There's seed cake on the table, quite fresh." Graves accepted a slice, though his expression implied he'd rather be talking than eating. Dr. Penrose confirmed it. Heart failure, but brought on by something. Traces of digitalis in his system. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Digitalis? Why, that's heart medicine, is it not?" "Yes. But too much of it, Miss Marple, and it stops the heart instead of helping it. And here's the odd part. Jerome wasn't prescribed any." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Then someone must have helped him to it, and perhaps knew just how much would seem accidental." The inspector sighed. "You're thinking murder, aren't you?" "I rarely think anything, Inspector. I merely notice. The garden gate, for instance. It had been locked for the first time in years. Someone wanted privacy that afternoon." Graves leaned forward. "And you've a theory?" "I have several," she said pleasantly, "but none ripe enough to pick." He smiled despite himself. You always speak in riddles, Miss Marple. Life is rather full of them, Inspector. But I dare say when we find who had reason to fear an old letter, we shall be much nearer the truth. A curious conversation at the Green. That evening Miss Marple took her usual walk to the Green, where the villagers still gathered despite the drizzle. The butcher's wife, Mrs. Copley, mother of the young post office assistant, greeted her warmly but nervously. "You'll have heard, Miss Marple." My Ernest was questioned again. They say Mr. Jerome had words with him over the postal accounts, but I swear my boy's honest as daylight. "I'm sure he is," said Miss Marple kindly. "And daylight, you know, can be quite revealing. One sees all sorts of spots one missed before." As she turned the corner toward her cottage, she saw Miss Nora Blackwood approaching. The young woman looked unusually flushed, her gloved hands trembling slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "do you suppose it's true that he was poisoned?" "I never suppose, my dear, but it seems the police are considering that possibility." Miss Blackwood hesitated. "Well, I don't quite know why I'm telling you this, but I did see Mr. Jerome 2 nights before he died. Near the vestry after dark. He was arguing with someone, a man. I couldn't see who. It was too dim. But he was angry. Terribly angry." "Anger," said Miss Marple softly, "is a most revealing emotion. It shows us where people's fears are buried." Nora nodded nervously. "And the next day, that poor man dead by the gate. It's dreadful, isn't it?" "Yes, dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, "and curious. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, does anyone in your family have a surname beginning with R?" The young woman blinked. "Why, yes. My mother's maiden name was Ravenhurst. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, no reason, my dear. I have a fondness for old initials. They can be rather telling." The notebook closes. That night Miss Marple sat once again at her writing desk, the little silver button before her and her notebook open. She wrote, "Ravenhurst. Letter in vestry drawer. Jerome fearful. Poison deliberate. Who profits from silence?" She paused, tapped her pen, and added, "A quarrel heard. A gate locked. A name forgotten. Until found." Then she folded her hands, listening to the soft tick of the clock and the distant rustle of the wind through her garden hedge. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, unseen and unsuspecting, someone was lying awake too, watching, waiting, and wondering how much the quiet old lady in St. Mary's Lane already knew. Chapter 4. A Shadow over Willowbrook. For the next few days, Willowbrook seemed suspended between ordinary life and something darker, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The shops opened as usual, the church bell rang, and the children walked to school. Yet a subtle unease clung to the air, something that couldn't be dusted away with a feather duster or dismissed over tea. Miss Marple, whose sense of quiet observation was as fine as lacework, felt it keenly. She saw it in the way people paused mid-sentence when she passed, in the quick flutter of curtains, and in how the laughter at the Rose and Crown now carried an edge of nervousness. Gossip, once the village's comfort, had turned into a form of fear. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was always when truth began to creep through the cracks. Dr. Penrose's remark. That morning she made her way along the lane to Dr. Penrose's surgery, carrying with her a small basket of gooseberries, a neighborly gesture, but as always with Miss Marple, never without purpose. The doctor, a precise man of middle age with thinning hair and the slightly distracted air of someone used to patients who talk too much, welcomed her with a faint smile. "Miss Marple, how very kind. I confess I'm not quite sure what to do with gooseberries, but Mrs. Penrose will no doubt manage." "I've heard she makes an excellent fool," Miss Marple said mildly, taking a seat. "And how are you, Doctor? I dare say these events have been quite trying." Penrose sighed and removed his spectacles. "Indeed they have. Poor Jerome, his was not an easy case. I never treated him regularly, of course, but he was a proud man. Liked to prescribe his own medicine, you know. Digitalis, for instance, though he had no need of it." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. He bought digitalis himself? Apparently so. I found a small bottle in his pocket when the inspector asked me to examine his effects. Quite old, too. No label, no chemist's name. He must have had it for years. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, it killed him only last week. How very interesting. The doctor hesitated. I did find something else rather odd. His blood pressure was quite normal for a man his age, but there was a mark on his wrist. A faint bruise, circular, almost as if someone had held him, or pressed something against him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. One rarely bruises oneself in so neat a fashion. I suppose that detail was of interest to Inspector Graves. Oh, yes, said the doctor. He's convinced now it's murder. He's gone and arrested young Ernest Cobley this morning. Poor lad looked terrified. Miss Marple sighed softly. Ah, yes, the wrong person first. It always seems to happen that way. People so like tidy solutions. The arrest. By noon, the news had spread across the village like spilled ink. Ernest Copley arrested for the murder of Mr. Jerome. The words were repeated, embroidered, and whispered behind lace curtains. Mrs. Larkin wept loudly in her shop. The colonel declared it clear as day. And Mrs. Ellison shook her head and said how dreadful it was that young people these days had no morals. Miss Marple, walking quietly along the high street, paused at the post office, now shuddered with official seals across the door. The small brass sign gleamed in the pale sun, and she traced the edge of it with her gloved finger. Then she turned sharply on her heel and began the short walk to Marleycombe, where the police station stood. A visit to Inspector Graves. Inspector Graves, when she arrived, was seated behind his desk, looking rather pleased with himself. Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard, I take it? We've got our man. So I understand, she said pleasantly. Ernest Copley, the assistant. That's right. The boy was in debt, apparently, money missing from the postal till. We found an envelope addressed to him among Jerome's papers, never posted, mind you, demanding repayment and threatening dismissal. He had motive, means, and opportunity, and he was at the vicarage that afternoon. Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. Inspector, have you ever noticed how certain kinds of men, precise men like Mr. Jerome, tend to keep letters in drawers rather than post them? Graves frowned. You mean? I mean that the letter may have been written, yes, but perhaps not by him. One could imitate his style easily enough. His handwriting was very deliberate. Graves frowned again, tapping his pencil. You think someone forged it? Oh, not necessarily forged. Perhaps merely used his paper and pen. It's remarkable how careless people are about leaving both lying about. Graves rubbed his temple. You always manage to make things more complicated, Miss Marple. Not complicated, she said gently, merely accurate. A garden conversation. That evening Miss Marple found herself in her garden trimming the lavender hedge when Nora Blackwood appeared at the gate. The girl looked pale and agitated. Miss Marple, may I speak with you? I'm afraid something dreadful has happened. Miss Marple put down her shears. Of course, my dear. Do come in. Nora twisted her gloves. They've arrested Mr. Copley, haven't they? But I don't believe he did it. He's too timid. He can't even argue without blushing. And I think I know who Mr. Jerome was meeting that night. Indeed? Said Miss Marple, pouring tea. And who might that be? The girl leaned forward, her voice trembling. My uncle, Colonel Harcourt. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly, though she showed no surprise. Your uncle? Yes. I wasn't sure at first, but I saw him. His coat, his hat, by the vestry door that night. He said later he'd been out walking, but he was arguing with Jerome. And Uncle had reason to be angry. Mr. Jerome handled the accounts for the War Memorial Fund, and there was money missing. Uncle said it would ruin his reputation if word got out. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her expression thoughtful. Reputation is a fragile thing, my dear. Like fine china. It can crack with the smallest pressure. Nora nodded miserably. Do you think he? My dear, said Miss Marple gently. "I think one should never decide guilt or innocence without all the threads in hand. But perhaps you might tell me one thing more. Did your uncle ever own a coat with silver buttons?" Nora looked up sharply. "Yes. His old regimental coat. He still wears it sometimes. It has the initial R engraved on each button. For the Royal Regiment." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, how very patriotic." The quiet resolve. That night, long after Nora had gone, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the silver button glinting faintly beside her notebook. She wrote in neat script, "Earnest innocent, letter forged, Harcourt quarrel, button from regimental coat." Then after a pause she added another line, "The gate that never locked, used that night by 2 men, not one." She laid down her pen and gazed into the fire, her eyes reflecting its light. Somewhere faintly the church bell tolled the half-hour, and though no one in Willowbrook yet knew it, the calm before the storm was almost over. Chapter 5. Tea and Theories. It was a bright morning in Willowbrook, though the brightness seemed to sit awkwardly upon the village that day. Sunshine glinted off the thatched roofs and made the cobblestones shine, yet every conversation carried a shadow. The murder of Arthur Spenlow had become the chief subject of breakfast tables and garden fences alike, spreading from the grocer's to the post office with the ease of wildfire. At precisely 11 o'clock, Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and furniture polished to a soft gleam. The table before her was neatly set. 2 cups, a plate of shortbread, and the morning's newspaper folded with care. Seated opposite her, leaning forward with restless energy, was Mr. Leonard Hawthorne, the church organist and, according to most accounts, the village's unofficial collector of gossip. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "Simply dreadful. I've played at funerals, of course, but never have I known a death to grip the village quite like this one. Poor Spenlow, though I dare say not everyone thought kindly of him." Miss Marple poured the tea with calm precision. "Oh, and what makes you say that, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Well," he said, lowering his voice instinctively, "he could be, how shall I put it, difficult. Very proper, very exacting. Expected things done his way. He and young Peter Copley had a frightful row last month over the garden wall. Something about the boundary line or the roots of a hedge encroaching. The whole street heard it, or so Mrs. Finch tells me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe Mrs. Finch hears quite a lot from her window." "She does indeed," said Mr. Hawthorne with a chuckle. "But she's not the only one. Mrs. Larkin mentioned seeing a man at the back of the Spenlow property the evening before the murder. Tall fellow, dark coat, walking toward the old garden gate that never locks." Miss Marple set down her cup thoughtfully. "How very curious. Yes, but she didn't see his face, and the police don't seem terribly interested. They're quite satisfied it was Mr. Copley. They found the spade with his fingerprints on it, you know." Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered with mild interest. "And where was this spade found?" "In the potting shed. Inspector Graves said so himself." "Ah," she murmured. "A potting shed that stands open to the garden, I believe." "Quite right," said Hawthorne. "You think someone might have moved it there?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She smiled instead, the kind of gentle, distracted smile that often hid the fact that her mind was already 3 steps ahead. "It's very odd, Mr. Hawthorne, how often one hears of things being found exactly where they ought to be, almost as though someone wanted them to be found there." Hawthorne blinked. "You think it's a setup?" "Oh, I shouldn't like to speculate," she said lightly. "But human nature is a strange and untidy thing. People can be most inventive when they wish to shift suspicion." Before Mr. Hawthorne could pursue the matter, a knock came at the door. It was Miss Hartnell from the Women's Institute, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, dear, you'll never believe it. Inspector Graves has been questioning Mrs. March at the post office. He's found something rather important." Miss Marple raised her brows mildly. "Indeed?" "They've discovered that Arthur Spenlow sent a telegram the afternoon before he died," Miss Hartnell continued breathlessly. "Addressed to someone in London. A woman, apparently. How very intriguing, said Miss Marple. Do you recall the name? Something like C. Denham, I think. Graves wouldn't say more. Miss Marple thanked her politely and waited until both visitors had gone. Then she sat back in her chair, eyes unfocused, tracing invisible patterns on the armrest with one gloved finger. A telegram to London, a quarrel over property lines, a spade found conveniently close at hand. Outside her window, a robin landed on the garden wall, chirping brightly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Nature, she thought, was rarely deceitful, unlike people who so often tidied their lies to look like truth. She rose, took her hat from the stand, and locked her door. There was one person in Willowbrook she wished to speak to before luncheon, Mrs. Larkin, whose memory for faces might be sharper than she realized, and perhaps, Miss Marple thought, the garden gate that never locked might yield another secret before the day was done. Chapter 6. The Man at the Gate. The afternoon air in Willowbrook carried that peculiar stillness which often follows a morning of gossip. The village seemed quieter, though not calm, more like a place holding its breath. The gravel lanes shimmered faintly in the late sun, and beyond them, the hedgerows whispered with unseen sparrows. Miss Marple walked at her customary unhurried pace, parasol in one hand, a sensible handbag in the other. She nodded to Mrs. Finch, who was trimming her roses with all the self-importance of a court gardener, and to young Tommy Reed, who looked suspiciously idle near the green. Her destination was a small whitewashed cottage at the edge of the village, home to Mrs. Larkin, the very woman who claimed to have seen a stranger near the Spenlow garden gate the evening before the murder. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish and damp wood. Mrs. Larkin, a broad-shouldered widow with a fine opinion of her own good sense, ushered Miss Marple in with evident pride. "I said to my Alf years ago," she began without preamble, "that one day my eyes would be useful to someone. You know me, Miss Marple. I notice things. Always have." "I've heard so," said Miss Marple kindly, taking a seat near the window. "Mr. Hawthorne mentioned you'd seen a man by the Spenlow property the evening before that dreadful night." Mrs. Larkin nodded so vigorously her cap quivered. "I did, indeed. 8:15 it was, or thereabouts. I'd gone to fetch the milk. Mrs. Copley keeps a cow, you know, and I saw him just beyond the hedge, tall, wearing a dark overcoat, walking toward the garden gate." "The one at the back?" "Yes, that gate. Never did latch properly. I told Mr. Spenlow about it once, but he said it kept the air moving." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A most unusual reason for leaving a gate unlocked." Mrs. Larkin nodded approvingly, as though Miss Marple had passed a small test. "Quite so. Anyway, this man, he wasn't from Willowbrook, I'll swear to it. I know everyone here. He had the look of someone used to cities. His shoes were polished, if you take my meaning." "I do indeed," said Miss Marple, who could read entire lives from a person's shoes. "Did he carry anything?" "Not that I saw. But he stopped for a moment just before the gate and looked back, as if to make sure no one was watching." Miss Marple's hands folded in her lap. "And then?" "Then he went in. Quiet as a cat. I'd have gone closer, only it was nearly dark, and, well, one doesn't like to meddle." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course. And you've told all this to Inspector Graves?" "I have, but he said it didn't fit. They've got Peter Copley, haven't they? A young fool though he is, I never thought him the murdering kind." Miss Marple rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan. "Thank you, Mrs. Larkin. You've been most helpful. Might I trouble you with one last question?" "Of course, Miss Marple. This man you saw, tall, dark coat, polished shoes, did he by any chance wear a hat?" Mrs. Larkin blinked, then frowned. "Now you mention it, no. And isn't that odd? Most men wear one, especially strangers." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind began to stir. A man who took care to polish his shoes but went bareheaded at dusk? That was the sort of inconsistency she liked best, the kind that hinted at disguise rather than chance. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple turned her steps not toward home, but toward the narrow lane that led past the Spenlow property. The garden gate stood at the far end, half hidden by climbing ivy and nettles. It did as Mrs. Larkin said, hang loosely on its hinges, open just enough to whisper secrets to the wind. She pushed it gently and heard it creak. The lock was rusted and worn, but something else caught her eye. A thin sliver of torn fabric snagged on the lower hinge. Dark blue. Perhaps from a coat, perhaps not. She bent closer, inspecting it with the keen patience of a natural observer. There was a faint trace of something on it, a smell sharp and unfamiliar, like machine oil or varnish. Miss Marple straightened slowly. "How very, very interesting," she murmured. At that moment the sound of footsteps echoed along the path behind her. She turned to see Inspector Graves approaching, his expression a mixture of surprise and faint irritation. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be poking around here," he said with forced politeness. "I do wish you'd leave this business to the police." She smiled mildly. "Oh, I have no intention of interfering, Inspector. I was merely admiring the workmanship of the gate. Such a pity no one thought to repair it sooner." Graves frowned at the gate, then at her. "You've found something, haven't you?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though it may be nothing at all. I do so often find that the smallest things, the ones everyone overlooks, tend to matter the most." He sighed. "If you know something useful, you'd better tell me." "Indeed I shall," she said pleasantly, "when I'm quite sure what it means." And with that she left him staring after her, the gate creaking faintly in the wind, as though it too knew secrets it wasn't ready to share. Chapter 7. The telegram from London Rain came softly to Willowbrook the following morning, a fine mist that blurred the hedgerows and gave the cobblestones a slick, silvery sheen. The village, usually so quick to chatter, seemed subdued. Doors closed, curtains half drawn. The only sound along the high street was the rhythmic tap of Miss Marple's umbrella as she walked toward the post office. Inside, the scent of damp wool and ink filled the air. Behind the counter stood Mrs. March, the postmistress, a capable red-cheeked woman whose memory for details rivaled the vicar's for sermon length. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, immediately softening into a smile. "Well, Miss Marple, out and about despite the weather. I do hope you're not catching cold." "Oh, not at all, dear," said Miss Marple cheerfully, closing her umbrella. "I find a bit of drizzle keeps one sharp. I was hoping to ask you about that telegram Mr. Spenlow sent the day before he died." Mrs. March's expression flickered with both curiosity and caution. "Now, Miss Marple, I shouldn't be talking about police business." "Quite right," said Miss Marple agreeably. "Quite right indeed, but you know I've always found that a curious mind can be useful, especially when one wishes to see justice properly done." Mrs. March pursed her lips, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, I can't give you much, mind. But I will say it was sent to a Miss C. Denham in London, address on Baker Street of all places. And the message itself, only 5 words. It must be tonight. Urgent." "Baker Street," repeated Miss Marple softly. "And this Miss Denham, does the name mean anything to you?" Mrs. March shook her head. "Never heard of her." "But she must have been important to Mr. Spenlow. He paid extra for express delivery." Miss Marple thanked her kindly, bought a sheet of stamps she didn't need, and stepped back into the street. She stood for a moment beneath her umbrella, thinking. A telegram to a woman in London, a man seen at the garden gate that same evening, and the faint smell of oil or varnish on a scrap of blue fabric. It was beginning, as she would have said, to form a pattern, though not yet a picture. As she turned toward the vicarage, she nearly collided with Inspector Graves, striding briskly from the opposite direction, his hat pulled low against the rain. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, "you seem to turn up wherever I go." "Pure coincidence, Inspector," she said serenely. "Have you had any progress?" Graves grunted. "Plenty of gossip, little sense. We've questioned young Copley again. His story hasn't changed. Claims he hadn't spoken to Spenlow in days, but I've got reason to believe otherwise." "Oh?" Graves nodded grimly. "There's a witness, Mrs. Finch, of course, who says she saw Copley near Spenlow's house the night before the murder. late, around 10. And there's something else. We found a train ticket in Spenlow's coat pocket. London to Willowbrook, return. Dated the same day as that telegram. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. How very interesting. So Mr. Spenlow had been in London that day? Yes, but what business he had there, no one knows. Perhaps this Miss Denham holds the key. My men are trying to locate her. Miss Marple gave a mild smile. I shouldn't be surprised if she's rather harder to find than you expect. Why do you say that? Oh, just a feeling, she, said softly. London can be quite accommodating to those who prefer not to be found. Graves frowned, clearly unsettled. You've heard something, haven't you? From one of your friends? Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly serene. Only that one should never underestimate the ways in which respectable people arrange their affairs. Even the most ordinary lives can contain complexities. The inspector sighed. You'll drive me mad one of these days, Miss Marple. She smiled kindly. I do hope not, Inspector. The village needs you far too much. As he marched off toward the police station, Miss Marple continued down the lane, her thoughts racing quietly beneath her composed exterior. Arthur Spenlow had gone to London and sent an urgent telegram to a woman there. Hours later, a stranger appeared at his garden gate, tall, well-dressed, hatless, and by morning, Spenlow was dead. It was possible, of course, that Miss Denham had nothing to do with it, but Miss Marple knew better than to believe in coincidence. She stopped by the post office window and looked back toward the mist-covered road that led out of the village. Somewhere beyond it, perhaps in a modest flat on Baker Street, someone was waiting for news that would never come. And Miss Marple, tightening her shawl against the drizzle, resolved that she would find out who Miss C. Denham was, and what secret had drawn her name into the quiet death of Arthur Spenlow. Chapter 8. The Lady from Baker Street. By the next morning the rain had passed, leaving Willowbrook rinsed and glistening beneath a pale, hesitant sun. The church bells rang faintly across the village green, calling a modest congregation to midweek prayers. But Miss Marple, though she had her prayer book neatly marked, found herself otherwise occupied that morning. She was at her writing desk by 9:30, spectacles balanced on her nose, composing a letter in her tidy looping hand, to Miss C. Denham, Baker Street, London. Dear Madam, I am writing concerning the late Mr. Arthur Spenlow of Willowbrook, who I understand corresponded with you shortly before his most unfortunate passing. I would be most grateful if you could confirm whether you received his telegram dated the 22nd, and if you might be kind enough to provide any recollection of your acquaintance with him. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. It was a simple letter, polite and unassuming. But Miss Marple knew that directness often yielded better results than authority. Once sealed and stamped, she placed it in her basket and set out toward the post office. On her way she passed Mrs. Finch's gate, where the woman herself stood holding court with Mrs. Hartnell and the grocer's wife. Their voices lowered at her approach, though not quickly enough to conceal the subject. "Good morning, ladies," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Mrs. Finch, ever the picture of false modesty, blushed. "Oh, Miss Marple, we're just saying what a dreadful shock all this business is. Though if you ask me, it's all quite plain. Young Peter Copley lost his temper, and that's that." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I dare say the police may think so too. But I've always found, Mrs. Finch, that when things appear too plain, there's usually something not quite right beneath the surface." The grocer's wife chuckled nervously. "Trust Miss Marple to find a mystery in a teapot." Miss Marple inclined her head and continued on her way. But as she reached the lane that curved past the Spenlow property, something caught her attention. The gate, the same garden gate that had stood stubbornly ajar since the murder, was closed. That in itself was nothing remarkable. But Miss Marple was a woman who noticed patterns, and patterns, she knew, do not shift without reason. She paused, gloved hand resting lightly on the latch. The iron was still damp from the rain, and faint footprints led away from it. Not the broad marks of a man's boots, but smaller, narrower, almost elegant prints. A woman's shoes, perhaps. A prickle of curiosity stirred. She followed the path a few yards further, just until it bent toward the rear of the garden. There, on the stone border, lay something small and glinting faintly in the morning light. A button. Miss Marple stooped to pick it up. It was pearl, delicate with a fine edge of silver, not the sort of trimming one found on the dresses of Willowbrook's matrons. She turned it over thoughtfully. "Now who," she murmured, "comes to a murder scene dressed like that?" By noon she was taking tea with Reverend Chalmers and his sister, Miss Lydia Chalmers, in the vicarage drawing-room. Lydia, who prided herself on her good sense and her even better gossip, was in rare form. "Did you hear, Miss Marple? Inspector Graves has sent word to London about that telegram. He's found Miss Denham, or at least a Miss Denham. Works as a secretary to some business firm in Marylebone. She's coming down to Willowbrook tomorrow to speak with him." Miss Marple stirred her tea, calm as ever. "How very efficient of the inspector. I do hope she travels safely." "Oh, I expect she will. Though between you and me, I'd not be surprised if there's a touch of scandal in it, the way these London women dress, and all that talk of secretaries and business trips." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One should be careful, Lydia, not to confuse style with sin. I have often known good women wear very fashionable hats." The Reverend coughed into his cup, half in amusement, half in caution. "Jane has a point, my dear." That afternoon, back in her own cottage, Miss Marple laid the pearl button on her writing table beside her magnifying glass and knitting needles. She sat for a while, gazing at it in silence. There was something about the timing, the urgency of the telegram, and now this. A woman's trace where there should have been none. If Miss C. Denham had come to Willowbrook that evening, then perhaps Mrs. Larkin had not seen a man after all. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, she had seen exactly what she was meant to see. The next day would tell her more. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression serene but her eyes bright with thought. "Yes," she said quietly to herself, "tomorrow will be a very revealing day indeed." Chapter 9. Miss Denham Arrives. Miss Denham's arrival at Stonygates adds a new layer of intrigue to the atmosphere. She is a poised and intelligent young woman, polite, efficient, and always composed. Her manner is calm and quiet, but there's something about her that feels guarded, as though she carries a private burden or a secret she cannot reveal. Mrs. Sadler, the matron, and some of the staff speak highly of her, admiring her capability and kindness toward the boys at the institution. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes notice details others miss. The way Miss Denham's expression momentarily hardens when someone mentions Louis Serracold, and the faint shadow that passes over her face when Gulbranson's name comes up. Louis Serracold himself seems particularly attentive to her, perhaps more than is appropriate for a man of his position. Carrie Louise, his wife, seems blissfully unaware of this. She treats Miss Denham like a daughter, with warmth and trust. Miss Marple, however, senses tension beneath the surface. Soon whispers begin to circulate among the residents that Miss Denham is not who she appears to be. There are hints that she might have a connection to one of the troubled young men in the institution, or even to the Serracold family's past. Though nothing is proven yet, Miss Marple's instincts tell her that Miss Denham's arrival is no coincidence. As she quietly observes, she begins to piece together subtle clues. Tone of voice, glances exchanged, and the strange unease that seems to hang in the air whenever Miss Denham enters the room. Something is coming, and Miss Marple knows that Miss Denham stands at the center of it. Chapter 10. The tension grows. As the days pass at Stonygates, the air becomes increasingly heavy with unease. The once calm and orderly atmosphere is now charged with tension that everyone feels but no one dares to name. Even the young men in the rehabilitation program seem restless. Quarrels break out more easily, tempers flare, and a sense of watchfulness lingers in every corner. Miss Marple, always observant, notices subtle shifts in behavior. Louis Serracold is distracted and nervous, constantly disappearing into his study for private business discussions. Carrie Louise remains her gentle, optimistic self, but there's a tremor in her smile, a kind of blind hope that all is well, even when her intuition tells her otherwise. Miss Denham, meanwhile, becomes even more mysterious. She moves about quietly, performing her duties with mechanical precision, yet her eyes often seem far away, filled with worry or guilt. At times, she avoids looking at Louis Serracold altogether, and at other moments there's a strange tension between them, a silence that feels loaded with unspoken truth. Christian Gulbranson's name begins to surface in conversation more frequently. He was Carrie Louise's stepson, and had recently written a letter suggesting he was concerned about something happening at Stony Gates. His words hinted at danger, something or someone threatening the safety of the household. Miss Marple's suspicions deepen. She can feel that a crisis is nearing, the stillness before a storm. Every sound, every look, every whispered conversation seems to carry a hidden meaning. She begins quietly gathering information, listening more than speaking, and waiting for the moment when the truth will finally break through the tension that grips the house. And then one night, that moment arrives, suddenly and violently. Chapter 11. The Murder at Stony Gates. It happens on a cold, still evening, the kind of night when silence seems almost alive. The household at Stony Gates has gathered in the drawing-room after dinner. The fire burns low, the shadows stretch long across the floor, and there's a strange edge in the air, a sense of unease that no one can quite explain. Louis Serracold is speaking to one of the young men from the Institute, his tone calm but firm. Carrie Louise sits nearby, working on her embroidery, her pale face lit by the flicker of the fire. Miss Denham is at the writing table, quietly sorting papers, while Miss Marple knits with apparent serenity, though her sharp eyes miss nothing. Suddenly there's a commotion in the hallway. A door slams, hurried footsteps echo, and a voice, trembling, frightened, calls out, "Something's wrong, Mr. Gulbranson!" The room freezes. Carrie Louise's needle drops from her hand. Louis Serracold rises instantly, his expression darkening. Together they rush toward the study, with Miss Marple following close behind. The sight that meets them there stops everyone in their tracks. Christian Gulbranson lies slumped over the desk, his head resting on his arm. The papers before him are spattered with blood. A single bullet wound marks his temple. The revolver lies on the floor beside him. Carrie Louise lets out a low cry and sways. Louis catches her just before she falls. For a moment no one speaks. The only sound is the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Louis mutters, This can't be happening here." Miss Marple steps forward, her gaze cool and steady. "No," she says softly. "It didn't happen by chance. Someone made quite sure of that." Within minutes, the police are summoned. The men from the Institute are locked in their quarters. No one is allowed to leave the main house. The corridors, once calm, are filled with the echo of hurried voices and the crackle of radio calls. Miss Marple, however, stands very still, her eyes on the papers scattered over Gulbranson's desk. She notices one half-crumpled sheet, a letter, unfinished, addressed to someone in London. The last words are faint but legible. "I have reason to believe that Carrie Louise is in grave danger." She folds her hands, her expression grave. "So," she murmurs, almost to herself. "He knew, and now someone has made certain he would tell no one else. The peace of Stony Gates is broken. The storm Miss Marple had sensed has come, and she knows that before it passes, more secrets will be uncovered than anyone in that house dares imagine." Chapter 12. Miss Marple begins her investigation. The following morning dawned pale and heavy, as though the mist itself were reluctant to move across the lawns of Stony Gates. A thin drizzle hung in the air, softening the sharp edges of the world. The police had remained overnight, their motor cars leaving long muddy tracks along the gravel drive. Miss Marple sat in the small morning room beside the window, her knitting untouched in her lap. A pot of tea had grown cold on the tray before her. The gentle hum of the household was gone, replaced by whispers, hurried footsteps, and the clink of china handled too carefully. Carrie Louise had not slept. She had been kept in her room under the doctor's insistence. Her husband, Louis Sericold, moved restlessly through the house, giving instructions with clipped words, his composure only just holding. Inspector Curry, a solid, square-shouldered man from the county police, had arrived before dawn. He was not unkind, though his manner was brisk and businesslike. His notebook was always open, his pencil always ready. Miss Marple liked him at once. He had the quiet air of one who listened more than he spoke. The inspector had begun his inquiries in the study where Mr. Gulbranson had been found. The room remained much as it had been left, papers still scattered, the faint metallic smell of blood clinging to the air. "He was shot at close range," Curry said gravely. "Revolver found beside him. No fingerprints. At least none that shouldn't be there." "Suicide?" Louis Sericold suggested quickly. Christian was an anxious man, perhaps overburdened. The inspector shook his head. "No powder burn, sir, and the angle of the wound makes it unlikely. Whoever fired that shot stood behind him, perhaps while he was seated at the desk." Miss Marple looked up at the desk, the same place where she had seen Mr. Gulbranson sitting only the previous evening, his spectacles catching the light as he bent over his writing. She spoke quietly. "And the letter, Inspector? The one addressed to London?" Curry nodded, turning a page of his notes. "Unfinished. It seems he was interrupted. Mentions a danger to Mrs. Sericold, though he doesn't say by whom. We've sent it for analysis, of course." Miss Marple's pale eyes grew thoughtful. "It is curious, isn't it? How people sense danger most clearly when it is already too late. Poor Mr. Gulbranson must have seen something, or heard something, that told him the pattern of events was all wrong." The inspector regarded her with mild curiosity. "You seem to know something about patterns, Miss Marple." "Oh, a little," she replied, smiling faintly. "You see, life in a small village, whether it's St. Mary Mead or a place like this, runs on patterns. The smallest break in routine can be quite revealing, if one knows where to look." Later that morning she moved quietly through the house, observing as only she could. She saw Miss Denham speaking to one of the staff in low tones, her eyes red but her expression composed. She saw Louis Sericold pacing the long gallery, his lips moving silently as if repeating some inner argument. And she noticed a pair of muddy footprints in the side corridor, not large enough for a man, and leading away from the small door that opened into the garden. A gardener, perhaps, or someone who preferred to come and go unseen. At luncheon the atmosphere was strained. The usual polite chatter was replaced by brief, cautious remarks. Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the table, observed everyone quietly, the tremor in Carrie Louise's hands, the darting glances between Louis and Miss Denham, the way the butler hesitated ever so slightly before pouring wine for the inspector. It was the sort of meal, she thought, where every word spoken was a test, and every silence a confession. When the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself and took a slow walk in the garden. The drizzle had stopped, though the air remained cool and heavy. She followed the path toward the small gate at the far end, the garden gate that never locked. It was ajar, as usual. She rested her hand upon it, thoughtful. So much, she reflected, depended upon the simplest of habits. A gate left open, a door not quite shut, a letter half finished. In all these little things, human nature betrayed itself. She turned back toward the house, her face set in quiet determination. The first threads of truth had begun to show themselves, and Jane Marple, who had spent a lifetime noticing the smallest of threads, knew how to follow them, no matter how tangled the skein. Chapter 13. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The day after the murder was unusually still. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, as if the house and its grounds carried a hush that warned against joy. Stonygates, once a refuge of quiet industry and good intentions, had become a place of secrets and unease. Miss Marple, who had taken her breakfast in her room, came down just as Inspector Curry was leaving the study. His face bore the look of a man who had listened to far too many words and believed only half of them. "Good morning, Inspector," she said mildly, pausing by the staircase. "Good morning, Miss Marple." He hesitated, then added, "You've been in this sort of thing before, I gather." "Once or twice," she admitted, eyes twinkling faintly. "And if I may venture to say so, Inspector, people are rarely killed without a great deal of talk beforehand. If one listens carefully, it's astonishing how much one learns." He gave a small smile. "Quite so, ma'am. Though in this house there's been rather too much talk, and none of it quite matches." That afternoon Miss Marple took it upon herself to call upon Carrie Louise. The poor woman was seated in her boudoir by the window, a lace handkerchief in one trembling hand. Her face was pale, but her voice when she spoke was steady. Too steady, perhaps. "My dear Christian," she murmured. "He came here so unexpectedly, and so kindly. I cannot believe he is gone." Miss Marple sat beside her, gentle and composed. "He must have cared for you very much," she said softly. "His letter suggests he was worried for your safety." Carrie Louise looked up, startled. "For me? Oh, that must be nonsense. Who could possibly wish me harm?" Miss Marple hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch. "There are many forms of harm, my dear. Not all involve hatred. Sometimes affection, when misplaced, can be equally dangerous." Carrie Louise's eyes drifted to the garden beyond the window. "Louis has been so devoted. The work here means everything to him. And yet," her voice faltered, "lately I have felt, oh, I don't know, as though something dark has entered the house, a whispering undercurrent, but one tells oneself not to be fanciful." Miss Marple took her hand. "You are not fanciful, Mrs. Sericold, when one lives among others, particularly those who are not altogether settled. One's instincts become rather good at warning when something is amiss." Meanwhile, the inspector's inquiries turned up peculiar facts. Mr. Gulbranson had spent much of the previous day reviewing the accounts and correspondence of the Institute. Several letters from benefactors and a few unsigned notes written in a woman's hand had been discovered among his papers. Miss Marple examined the copies quietly later that evening, after the inspector, with unspoken gratitude, had shared them over tea. "Very strange," she murmured. "See how each letter ends with that same phrase, 'for the good of the cause,' and yet the handwriting, it's deliberately disguised. Someone wished to seem anonymous, but could not resist a flourish on the G." Inspector Curry frowned. "You think you recognize it?" "I have my suspicions," Miss Marple said, "but handwriting is a delicate thing, a little like character. It reveals itself best when people are not thinking about it." Later that night, as rain began to fall again, Miss Marple ventured down the corridor near the library. A dim light shone under one door, the small study used by Miss Denham. She knocked softly. The younger woman opened the door, startled, then composed herself. "Miss Marple, I thought everyone had gone to bed. I often find I think better in the quiet hours." Miss Marple replied, "Forgive me, my dear, but I wondered if you had known Mr. Gulbranson before he came here." Miss Denham hesitated. "Only by name. He corresponded with Mr. Sericold about the Institute's finances. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Because he seemed to recognize you yesterday, when you came into the drawing-room. His expression changed rather sharply." A silence followed, thin, brittle, and dangerous. Then Miss Denham smiled, though her eyes did not match it. "You must have imagined it. He was an elderly man, perhaps easily startled." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Though I have found that people rarely mistake familiarity. It has a way of showing itself, no matter how carefully one conceals it." She left the room as softly as she had entered, but behind her, Miss Denham stood rigid, one hand pressed against her heart, the other gripping the edge of the desk. Outside, the rain fell harder. In the garden, the old gate creaked in the wind, swinging as ever slightly open. Miss Marple, pausing at her bedroom window, looked out toward it and murmured, "Secrets always find their way out, just as surely as that gate never shuts." The pieces were beginning to fit together. not clearly yet, but enough for her to see the faint outline of human motive. Jealousy, deception, and something far more complicated, love turned inward and twisted by fear. Chapter 14. The Second Clue. By the following morning, Stonygate seemed wrapped in a tense stillness, a waiting stillness, like the breath before a confession. The police had combed the grounds again, their boots leaving muddy imprints in the gravel, and the servants went about their duties in a kind of uneasy silence. Miss Marple, as usual, appeared serene, but behind her soft blue eyes her mind worked with quiet precision, sorting, connecting, and gently testing each thread of what she knew. The inspector had breakfasted early and gone into the village to make several inquiries. Before leaving, he had said with a half-smile, "If you happen to notice anything, Miss Marple, I'd be obliged if you'd let me know." To which Miss Marple had replied very modestly, "Oh, I rarely notice anything of importance, Inspector. Only the small things that everyone else forgets." And it was precisely one of those small things that morning which led her to what she would later call the second clue. Miss Marple had gone out for her customary stroll in the garden. The air was crisp, and a faint mist lay low over the lawns. She paused near the pond, watching the faint ripples that spread across its still surface. Something glittered faintly near the reeds. Curious, she stepped closer. A few yards beyond the path, half submerged in mud, lay a small object, a broken spectacle lens. Not a pair of spectacles, just one round lens, cracked cleanly across the middle, with a bit of twisted wire still attached. Miss Marple wrapped it delicately in her handkerchief. She remembered Mr. Gulbranson's spectacles very well, thin-rimmed, old-fashioned, square, not round, and this lens, quite unmistakably round, must therefore have belonged to someone else, someone who had been near the pond on the night of the murder. When she returned to the house, Miss Marple encountered Louis Sericold in the hall. He was pale and drawn, and his movements had a strange, nervous energy. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, "you're taking a turn about the garden. I envy you the calm of it. I can scarcely think these days. This business, it's dreadful for Carrie Louise." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "You must be quite worn with anxiety yourself. The police will find the culprit, no doubt, but sometimes, you know, people reveal more than they intend, in their haste to appear reasonable." He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing really," she said, smiling sweetly. "Only that it's very hard to tell truth from kindness. And yet, kindness can sometimes hide very dark motives." She left him standing in the hall, his expression uncertain, his hands clenched at his sides. Later, when Inspector Curry returned, Miss Marple invited him to the small morning room and laid the handkerchief on the table before him. He examined the cracked lens with care. "Found this in the garden, did you?" "Near the pond," she said, "and I think it's rather important. Mr. Gulbranson did not wear round spectacles, but I happen to recall someone who does, or rather did." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "Who, may I ask?" "Miss Denham," said Miss Marple gently. "She wore them when she first came here, though lately she's taken to wearing contact lenses. I dare say she broke these and thought no one would notice." Curry leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. "That's interesting. And you think she was out by the pond that night?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think someone was, and that someone might have seen or heard more than they wished to admit." That afternoon, as rain clouds gathered again, Miss Marple paid a brief visit to the small laboratory in the east wing, the room where Louis kept his records and scientific equipment. It was there she found something else peculiar, a faint scorch mark near the fireplace, and a smell that reminded her, quite distinctly, of gun oil. No one had mentioned that revolver being cleaned or fired recently, and yet here was evidence that someone, perhaps in agitation or haste, had tried to dispose of certain things by burning them. She stooped, picking up a tiny scrap of paper that had escaped. The flames. It bore only 2 words, half burned but legible: "Institute funds." She stood for a moment, holding the charred scrap between her fingers. So that was it then. Money and deception. Always at the heart of such tragedies, the same age-old motives. Love and greed, intertwined like ivy around a rotting tree. That evening the storm finally broke, thunder rolling over the hills, lightning flashing briefly across the lawns. Miss Marple sat in her room, her lamp burning low, knitting untouched beside her. She laid the cracked lens and the scorched scrap of paper side by side on the table, two small things, insignificant to anyone else, yet together they formed a pattern that was unmistakable. Her lips tightened ever so slightly. "Yes," she murmured. "The second clue confirms it. Poor Mr. Gulbranson stumbled too near the truth, and someone very desperate indeed silenced him." Outside the rain beat harder against the windows. In the darkness the garden gate creaked once more, open and then shut again. Miss Marple rose and went to the window, gazing out into the storm. The pattern was growing clearer now. The threads were tightening. Soon, very soon, they would reveal the hand that had woven them. Chapter 15. The trap is set. The next day dawned bright and brittle, as though the storm had washed everything clean, though Miss Marple knew better. Nothing was ever truly washed clean when deceit was involved. It merely went underground, waiting for its chance to rise again. The house at Stonygates was oddly quiet. The police had narrowed their inquiries, focusing now on the movements of those within the main building between 8 and 10 o'clock on the night of the murder. Everyone was uneasy. Doors closed a little too quickly. Glances met and darted away. Miss Marple took her breakfast in the dining room, alone except for the butler, who moved about with silent precision. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. The time for quiet observation was nearly over. The time for proof, or rather for revelation, had come. After breakfast she asked Inspector Carey for a private word in the library. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and wariness. "I believe," Miss Marple began, "that the facts you seek will not appear by further questioning, but by a little gentle staging. You see, Inspector, people often confess without words when faced with what they believe to be the truth coming to light." The inspector's pencil paused mid-note. "You mean to set a trap?" "A very small one," said Miss Marple mildly. "Nothing so theatrical as one reads in novels. Merely an arrangement that will allow conscience and fear to do their natural work." He nodded slowly. "And you're certain you know who it is?" Her knitting needles clicked softly as she smiled. "I believe I know who did it, but more importantly why. And it is always the why that convinces others to speak." That afternoon she went to Carrie Louise and suggested that everyone should gather in the drawing-room at tea. "A little company will do us all good," she said. "These dreadful events can only be borne by keeping to our civilized habits." At precisely 4 o'clock they gathered. Carrie Louise, pale but composed; Louis Sericold, restless and abstracted; Miss Denham, composed but with strained eyes; and several of the Institute's residents and staff, all subdued by the air of tension that clung to the house. Inspector Curry joined them quietly, standing near the fireplace. Miss Marple, in her usual place by the window, poured the tea herself. "It is remarkable," she began in her soft conversational tone, "how often the smallest things prove of the greatest importance. Take, for example, a garden gate that does not lock." Several faces turned toward her. She went on, calm and pleasant. "Because it never locks, one assumes it will always be open. And so if it should be found closed, even once, one must ask why. That is how patterns change, through the smallest of alterations." Louis Sericold shifted uneasily in his chair. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice a shade too sharp. "Only that someone went out through that gate on the night Mr. Gulbranson was killed," she said gently, "and that someone dropped a broken lens by the pond, a lens which could not have belonged to Mr. Gulbranson." Miss Denham's teacup trembled in her hand. Miss Marple's tone did not change. It seems to me that our poor visitor discovered something very unpleasant in the papers he was reviewing that evening. Something concerning the Institute's funds. Someone feared exposure and rather than risk it, chose to silence him. There was a stunned silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Then, quietly, she added, "He was shot from behind, which means it was someone he trusted enough to allow near him, someone who knew how to move quietly, who could have come and gone without notice, someone who had every reason to protect Mrs. Serocold from scandal." Louis Serocold's hand clenched on the arm of his chair. "This is outrageous," he said hoarsely. "You can't possibly mean—" But Miss Marple did not look at him. Her gaze rested instead on Miss Denham. The young woman had gone deathly pale. The lens of her remaining spectacles gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. "Mr. Serocold didn't pull the trigger, of course," Miss Marple said softly. "He could never bring himself to such violence. But you did, my dear, out of loyalty and love. You believed he was about to be ruined, and you thought you were saving him." Miss Denham rose suddenly, her voice sharp, almost desperate. "That's not true. I didn't mean I only—" Her words faltered. The truth had already spoken itself in the tremor of her voice, in the horror dawning on her face. Louis Serocold buried his face in his hands. "Mildred," he murmured. "Oh, my dear girl." Inspector Curry stepped forward, quiet and efficient, while Miss Marple looked away, her expression sorrowful. When the room had emptied and the rain began to fall once more outside, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire with Carrie Louise. "It's so dreadful," whispered Carrie Louise, "that such devotion could lead to this." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Devotion, my dear, can be the most dangerous thing in the world when it blinds one to right and wrong. In the end, murder often springs from the very qualities we admire most. Love, loyalty, protection, only twisted by fear." She folded her knitting neatly and rose. "The pattern is complete now. But I fear, for those who remain, it will take a very long time to unpick." Chapter 16. The Final Revelation and Aftermath. The atmosphere in Stonygates is thick with tension as Miss Marple quietly gathers everyone in the library. The fire burns low, throwing flickering shadows across the faces of those present, faces marked by fear, guilt, and uncertainty. It is time for the truth. Miss Marple, calm and precise, begins to recount the sequence of events. She reminds them of the inconsistencies, the overheard arguments, the misplaced keys, the curious timing of phone calls. Piece by piece, she reconstructs the night of the murder until the pattern becomes unmistakable. Everyone listens, breath held as she reveals the culprit, Miss Denham. The revelation shocks the room. But as Miss Marple explains, Miss Denham was not driven by greed or malice. She was consumed by revenge. Years ago, she had discovered that Louis Serocold's experiments had indirectly caused the breakdown of her family. She came to Stonygates under a false name, waiting for the right moment to expose him, but her plan spiraled out of control. When she realized that Serocold was manipulating minds for his reform work, she intended to frighten him, not to kill. Yet in the chaos of that night, fear and anger took over. The weapon hidden in the study was fired in a moment of panic. Serocold's death was the result of twisted intentions and buried pain. Miss Marple, with characteristic compassion, ends her explanation not with condemnation, but with understanding. "Evil," she says softly, "rarely comes in black and white. It hides in shades of sorrow and misplaced hope." As the police take Miss Denham away, the house feels lighter, but not entirely free. The echoes of guilt linger in every corridor. Mrs. Serocold sits quietly by the window, tears glistening in her eyes, while Julian Restorick leaves without a word. Later, Miss Marple stands alone in the garden, watching the first light of dawn touch the mist-covered lawns. Another mystery solved, another tragedy understood. Yet her eyes remain gentle, filled with the wisdom of one who sees not only crime, but the human heart behind it. In the end, Miss Marple murmurs, "Truth always comes to call, whether we invite it or not."